My name is Nicole Capizzello. I'm a social worker and advocate with Social Workers and Allies Against Solitary Confinement. The organization SWASC was founded in 2014 by social workers Mary Buser and Moya Atkinson. Since then, we've been committed to working with healthcare students and professionals and with impacted people to replace solitary confinement with humane alternatives. This presentation will discuss the issue of solitary confinement and human rights, the intersection of solitary and the social work profession, the work of social workers and allies against solitary confinement, and how we can work together to end solitary confinement internationally. While the facts and failures of the American criminal justice system have been increasingly discussed in recent years, these facts still bear repeating. Today, the United States makes up about 5% of the world's population, yet has 21% of the world's prisoners, the highest rate of incarceration in the world. Between 1980 and 2015, the number of people incarcerated in America increased from roughly 500,000 to now over 2.2 million. U.S. policing, sentencing, and incarceration disproportionately affect Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Black people are incarcerated at more than 5 times the rate of white people in the United States. So how does solitary confinement fit within this? First of all, solitary is the practice of isolating people in closed cells for 22 to 24 hours a day, without meaningful human contact, for days, months, years, or decades. In the United States, at least 80,000 people are held in solitary confinement in jails and prisons every day. It can go by many names: Special Housing Unit, or SHU, Administrative Seg, Adjustment Center, the Box, the Bing, Restricted Housing, Isolation, Supermax. Regardless of what we call it, it is profoundly damaging, physically, mentally, socially, emotionally, and spiritually, to individuals, families, and loved ones, communities, and society. And it's more likely to be used on Black, Indigenous, and people of color. A 2015 Yale Law School study found that nationally, Black males make up 14% of the population, 40% of the prison population, and constitute 45% of the restricted housing population. In New York City, 50,000 first-time jail admissions showed that Black people were 2.5 times more likely to enter solitary than white people. At a 2016 conference, Professor Michael Zygmunt said, "Isolation devastates the brain. There is no question about that. Without air, we will live minutes. Without water, we will live days. Without nutrition, we will live weeks. Without physical activity, our lives are decreased by years. Social interaction is part of these basic elements of life." Albert Woodfox is an activist and survivor of solitary confinement who spent more time in solitary than any American prisoner. He was released in 2016 after 43 years. He reflected on his time in solitary, saying, "Will this be the day? Will this be the day I lose my sanity and discipline? Will I start screaming and never stop? Will I curl up into a ball and become a baby, which was an early sign of going insane? Every day I pushed insanity away. Every day I had to find that strength. I had to find within me the will and determination not to break." In 2011, Juan Mendez, himself a survivor of solitary, and the former UN Special Rapporteur on Torture and Cruel, Inhuman, and Degrading Treatment, evaluated the use of solitary confinement in the U.S. criminal justice system. He called for a ban on nearly all uses of solitary, saying that it causes extreme mental and physical harm, and, if used in excess of 15 days, amounts to torture. His 2011 report recommended that the U.S. limit the use of solitary as a measure of last resort only. He also recommended that we prohibit the use of solitary confinement entirely with certain populations, including juveniles, people with serious mental illness, and pregnant women. He also recommended we ban prison regimes of solitary confinement, such as those in supermax facilities, and compile and regularly publish data on the use of solitary confinement and its impacts. Despite this, the U.S. continues to violate the human rights of its incarcerated citizens through this practice. So what is social workers' relationship to solitary confinement? Social workers can work throughout the criminal justice system, including in solitary confinement units. Mary Buser, a social worker and co-founder of SWASC, reflected on her time working in a solitary unit in a 2014 Washington Post op-ed entitled "Solitary Confinement's Mockery of Human Rights." She wrote, "During my tenure as an assistant chief of mental health on New York City's Rikers Island from 1998 to 2000, I worked in the punitive segregation unit, which is known as the Bing. Even if inmates had no psychiatric issues before they entered solitary, the strain of confinement makes mental decompensation swift. Our team was a constant presence in the 500-cell unit, doling out antidepressants, antipsychotics, and mountains of sleeping pills. When medication wasn't enough to hold a person's psyche together, when human behavior deteriorated into frantic scenes of self-mutilation, as often happened, we were called to cell doors." SWAS's goal is to end the torturous practice of solitary confinement, but at the same time, we also aim to support social workers currently working with people in solitary. Social workers and other medical and mental health professionals working in prisons experience a dilemma known as dual loyalty. This ethical dilemma is between a commitment to the client and a commitment to the practice setting, and can manifest in many ways. For instance, social workers may have to participate in a disciplinary review in which clients are sentenced to solitary confinement, or may be asked to complete a psychological evaluation designed to assess someone's ability to withstand the effects of prolonged solitary. SWASC faces many challenges, including an overwhelmed criminal legal system, with both a very large population and a high needs population. Corrections officers, administrators, and policymakers have the perception that solitary is a necessary tool for control within prisons. As discussed, there's also a lack of oversight of this practice, and solitary is hidden from sight. Many Americans do not realize that solitary confinement is being used at all, much less the extent of its use. Our prison system is also part of a capitalist society, and operated in a for-profit and sometimes privatized manner. We also are confronted with a culture of punishment and revenge, rather than rehabilitation, as well as many other systemic issues in American society, including white supremacy and racism, and a system that disproportionately affects poor people. SWASC's work focuses on undertaking the issues of racism, poverty, autocracy, political imprisonment, gender and LGBTQ discrimination, and inequity. We act in service of our mission to end solitary by letter writing with incarcerated people, promoting education on this topic and other ethical issues, visiting prisons and jails with reports on experiences and related actions, and participation with Black Lives Matter and other groups to fight against racism and racist systems. We advocate by supporting individuals and organizations to promote legislation and regulations to end solitary on a statewide level, nationally, and internationally. We help to develop policies that support individuals affected by this practice, including people who have been held in solitary and social workers working in the criminal legal system. We also share educational, advocacy, and action resources. We aim to educate with our website, mailing list, and quarterly newsletters. Our members speak on impactful panels and take part in discussions, both remote and in person, with formerly incarcerated people and advocates on the history of solitary confinement and the current status of its use. We also have created a bibliography, which includes free, easy-to-use toolkits and other workshops. The SWASC Bibliography Database, released in spring of 2020, recognizes that the most powerful approach to teaching and learning about solitary confinement is experiential, consisting of relevant activities coupled with reflection. Our bibliography, published by CSWE, contains over 300 entries, including books, films, essays, reports, PowerPoint presentations, and discussion guides, to facilitate learning about solitary confinement. The SWASC Bibliography Database is intended to be an educational resource for social workers, students, and others. It includes 5 toolkits, webinars, videos, and accompanying guides, all to facilitate learning and activism around this important issue. The SWASC Bibliography Database can be accessed online as a Google spreadsheet or as an Excel spreadsheet file at the following websites. In addition to continuing our educational efforts, SWASC also aspires to use its unique position as people with an insight into the criminal justice system and a commitment to upholding human rights, to work with others to create a template of regulations that prohibit social workers and other health professionals from involvement in the use of torture. To accomplish this goal, we would like to work with the Association of Social Work Boards on regulations to be adopted by every state. We would also like to work with the NASW to add to the Code of Ethics and include a phrase similar to that in the American Psychological Associations. Our second near-term goal is to collaborate to create an international task force to end solitary confinement through education, advocacy, legislation, litigation, regulations, and other action. This task force would include representatives from around the world, including professional associations, alternative organizations, and social work, health professional, and other allies. The task force work would be based on the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 5, as well as the Convention Against Torture, the Mandela Rules, and the Physician for Human Rights Report on Dual Loyalty and Human Rights in Health Professional Practice. It is time that we reflect on the criminal justice system that we have created, its impacts, and its future. Michelle Alexander, author of The New Jim Crow, asks, "The question is, do we want to create and maintain sites that are designed for the intentional infliction of needless suffering? Because that's what prison is today. They are sites where we treat people as less than human and put them in literal cages and intentionally inflict harm and suffering on them, and then expect that this will somehow improve them. It's nonsensical, immoral, and counterproductive, and that is what I would like to see come to an end. We hope you'll join us in this work. You can reach us by email, our website, or on Facebook. Thank you so much for learning about solitary confinement and the work of social workers and allies against solitary confinement.